Hello friends! It's been a hot minute since I put anything out on this channel, and I want to take this opportunity to go over some channel updates in light of the last few months and the general trajectory of the channel. And if you stick around to the second half, I'll be offering some answers to the various questions that people sent in for my 1k sub Q&A. If I don't get around to your question, it's probably because it got sent to me after I wrote and recorded this script. Don't worry, I'll keep note of extra questions somewhere and we'll likely do another Q&A at some future milestone. This video is going to be quite a low effort, lightly edited, sort of cozy kind of one, so go pour yourself a cuppa or get a mug of your favourite warm beverage, grab yourself a biscuit as a treat, and settle down for really just a bit of a natter. So first things first, let's get some channel updates. The most obvious update is we've grown a bit from 200 subs in mid-November to over 1,600 now, actually 1,700 since I wrote this script, mostly thanks to the boost from ThoughtSlime, for which I am hugely grateful. While I am grateful for this growth and for being able to reach more people with the radical interpretation of Christianity that we're working through here, this channel is still definitely finding its feet, and with such a large potential community, you have a larger pool of potential problems as well. For this reason, the first thing I want to do is probably set out the values of this channel again. What I want to do here is cultivate a kind of community of spiritual radicals, focused on people with left-leaning political inclinations who are engaging in the interpretation and reinterpretation of their faith in a dialectal relationship with that political call for liberation. While the content I produce here is based on my own religious tradition and thus will be exclusively geared towards Christian audiences, I do not consider it my place to talk on radical interpretations of other faiths. This community is open to folks from any, all, and no faith background. Atheists and agnostics are more than welcome if they find something of use in what I do, and even anti-theists who are willing to engage with the separation between the hierarchical religious institutions, which most people associate with religion, and community-based faith and spiritual practice. If you're one of the new atheist brand of fedora-tipping asshats who's only here to shout your god/gods isn't/aren't real at religious folk in my comments section, best just move along. I also want to stress that I want this community to be a safe space for people from all sexualities, gender identities, racialized or ethnic backgrounds, for neurodivergent folk and folks with disabilities, and for really anyone anywhere on the intersecting axes of oppression that our capitalist, statist, colonialist society propagates. As such, all forms of fascists, homophobes, gender criticals and other transphobes, white supremacists, and so on are not welcome on this channel. This includes all kinds of fascism and bigotry which claims basis in Christian theology. We do not want Christian nationalists here, we do not want people to justify homophobia or transphobia or other bigotry with scripture here, unless you are here because you have realised your mistake and you want to learn. With respect to all of this, I want to reaffirm this channel is not a free marketplace of ideas. It is a platform which is tied to my name and which I am cultivating, and for this reason, I will gladly use the banhammer on anyone who comes in here with the intention to harass or inflict harm on others. Moving on, the next update I want to address is my upload schedule, or lack thereof. As some of you may have noticed, I had a fairly consistent upload schedule through the latter half of last year, one which rapidly dropped off in November-December, with my only video in January being the one I was working on through December, and not really having any videos since. This has been the result of various personal issues which I am not going to disclose here. What this made me realise, however, is how unsatisfied I was with the way I was approaching this channel before. I was originally trying to put out a video every 2 weeks on the basis that regularly uploading channels tend to grow quicker, and this was the advice that you get given when you start working on YouTube, but I was sacrificing both the quality of the videos and my own happiness and well-being to do so, neither of which were worth giving up for whatever small boost in growth that regular update schedule got me. For this reason, I've chosen to set aside any attempt at a regular upload schedule. Instead, I'm committing to trying to make the best essays I can on a given topic, and I will release those essays when they are done. While this will hopefully improve the quality of videos I put out, it's definitely going to have a negative effect on how this channel gets represented in the YouTube algorithm, and as such I'm going to be a lot more dependent on you guys sharing these videos around to get any kind of traction on here. I'd also add that with less frequent uploads, it's more likely the videos I do post will be missed off your YouTube front page, so consider checking you're subscribed and clicking the bell so you never miss when those uploads do come. Lastly, I want to talk about the future goals of this channel. For now, I'm just going to keep writing down my thoughts and turning these into video essays when I come across something that I think others might find useful or informative. My next goal in terms of growth would be to get past 3,000 subscribers, because that is the number of congregants at the conservative and bigoted church that I got out of recently. And it would mean a lot for me personally to know that there are more people here listening to a deeper, richer, more radical interpretation of Christian faith than there are sitting through the often underlyingly bigoted preachers at that church. For now, I have no intention of turning this channel into my career or anything. I'm settling down into academia at the moment, and at present this means I don't have a Patreon or anything associated with this channel. That said, I have been struggling to make rent the last few months, so if there are folks here who would want to financially support the channel, if that were an option, I can look into what options there are there. Though I would still encourage you, if you have money to spare, give it to local, more directly effective groups, programs, or initiatives first. Don't be wasting your money on some opinion haver on the internet if your neighbour needs that money to cover food this week. Educational and theoretical content, like I tried to make here, is important for radical struggle, but it is nowhere near as important as that community-based activism that you can engage in, okay? So in terms of future milestone videos like this, I could do another Q&A if that's what people would like. I've also been kind of floating around the idea of doing some off-topic videos on things where I have an opinion or something useful I think I can add, but which just do not fall within the scope of this channel, so I couldn't really do them as normal videos. I've got a lot of interest in homebrew Dungeons and Dragons content, for example. My professional research is in linguistics, so if you wanted to hear my favourite dumb facts about language, for example, that could be another idea. And it would be quite fun, I think, to put together a community poll next time I hit a major milestone and see what kind of videos you guys would be interested in. If you think this sort of off-topic video idea is fun, then tell me in the comments. If you think it's really, really dumb, also tell me in the comments, because then I'll know not to put the effort in and I will just go for a traditional Q&A type thing like this. Speaking of Q&As though, let's get past those updates and move on to the question part of the video, which I present in no particular order. Our first question comes from YouTube commenter Quenzel, sorry if I mispronounce names, who asks, I've been away from my family for an exceptionally long period of time due to COVID. As time goes on, I feel more and more reluctant to interact with my generally right-wing Christian extended family. My sister-in-law's family are anti-vax prosperity Christians, as an example. Any advice navigating my inevitable next family gathering? This is obviously quite a difficult question, and one I've actually had to grapple with myself quite a bit, as a certain member of my family is a rather vocal defender of explicitly homophobic churches in the town where I live. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think there are a few things worth considering, all of which can really be subsumed under the general principle, pick your battles. If you can, avoid having these conversations, unless you're sure you're going to get the chance to properly explain your view and they're going to listen. 9 times out of 10, if you just casually drop progressive or socialist theology ideas into a conversation with ultra-conservative Christians, they're not going to be interested in trying to engage with that idea. They will see it as a threat to their established worldview and self-identity in that, and will spring to trying to defeat that idea, rather than engaging with it seriously. In such cases, no one wins. Sometimes, though, these conversations just can't be avoided, usually because the ultra-conservative has chosen to start up the issue of their own accord. In such cases, there are a few things that I think we should consider going into these situations. First and foremost is this conversation directly dangerous for someone who is in the room? If someone is being homophobic or transphobic in front of someone who you know is in the closet, if someone is being racist in front of BIPOC people in your family, etc., then those of us who have some social privilege have a responsibility to step in and shut it down, to protect those being targeted by harassment and abuse. Secondly, if no one is in direct danger of harm, evaluate the situation. Is this a big family gathering, or are you talking one-on-one? If there are bystanders, which view are they likely to be most open towards? What you'd like to avoid is getting stuck in an argument with 5 or 6 different people, because it can be difficult to satisfactorily respond to each statement each person might bring up. And if you're in a big gathering, or even with a few highly critical onlookers, it might be wisest to try and roll back the conversation or brush it off as best you can while staying true to your principles. Remember, very few people are persuaded by a single argument, and the best argument you can give for your views will often be how you live and help those around you. If you find that no one is in direct danger of harm, you have a mostly neutral or supportive audience, or better yet, you're in a one-on-one conversation, you could take this as a teaching opportunity, a chance to talk about your beliefs with these people. If you do, try to start from where they are at. Start from the Bible and whatever parts of their own belief you think could be conducive to the argument, and then push and pull to see how much they will budge on other points. Do they identify as pro-life? Ask about whether they think that means we as a society should do more to provide for the hungry. Are they prosperity gospelers? Ask what they think about Jesus insisting that no rich person can go to heaven. If they try to pull the, oh, it was actually a gate in Jerusalem thing, point out there's no historical evidence for that, and the disciples' response really doesn't make much sense if that were even true. So on and so on. If you get into this kind of argument, keep a close eye out for thought-terminating cliches. Phrases like, but the Bible clearly says that, it's against God's will, etc., etc. If you find the person you're talking to is using these phrases, try and pull those phrases out, challenge them to explain what they mean by that phrase. Did they say, the Bible clearly says? Ask where it says that. Ask what the original Greek and Hebrew phrases are, and what other interpretations have been proposed by biblical scholars. Pick apart the idea there is a single clear answer, and then you can bring in your own interpretations. The most important thing, though, is to remember that, for most people, ideology and worldview become integrated into self-perception and one's sense of identity. And that means that challenging people's ideological commitments and worldview is often a slow, gradual process of challenging assumptions and demonstrating alternatives, rather than a single knockdown argument or fierce confrontation. Focus on keeping others and yourself safe. If you get an opportunity to try and prod some people in the right direction, that's good too. But if all you can do is keep your head down until you get to leave, that's also okay. It's not your job to single-handedly save your family from the insidious influences of conservative Christianity. Do what you can, but realise your own limits too, and look forward to the times when you can laugh about what happened with your comrades or friends afterwards. The second question comes from Malcolm F. Cross on Twitter, who asks, what's your favourite science fiction to read, watch and play in that order? Now, this question is going to have me showing my whole ass a bit, because the unfortunate truth is that my media consumption is still far more geared towards mainstream, white, cis, male, Western creators than I would like. It's something I'm trying to work on, and if you know great fantasy or science fiction from people of colour, indigenous writers, queer writers, or other creators who bring a perspective which is usually marginalised by mainstream cis-heteropatriarchal, white supremacist, statist capitalism, I would love to hear about them. To answer the question though, in terms of reading, I think my all-time favourite science fiction has to be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's a classic for a reason, and although it's definitely slower and more self-reflective than a lot of modern science fiction, the writing is exceptional, and the exploration of themes of social creation and the nature of evil literally gets me every time. Runners-up would probably include Frank Herbert's Dune, which I'm currently reading and I've been enjoying so far, although I haven't actually finished it, so I can't really give a total ringing applause to that. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games, Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter's The Long Earth. I didn't actually enjoy the rest of the series that much, but the original Long Earth book is exceptional, and Lewis Lowry's The Giver is also, just beautiful as a piece of writing. In terms of sci-fi to watch, I'd probably have to say The Matrix is probably my favourite. I've currently only seen the first one, but I'm planning to watch all 3 sequels over the course of this year as and when I get the chance. In terms of runners-up, I am British, which means I have a legal obligation to include Doctor Who, especially the Eccleston and Tennant eras. I would also add Andy Stevenson's She-Ra and the Princess of Power, Christian Linke and Alex Yee's Arcane League of Legends from Netflix, which actually I have a video idea to talk about because it's such a beautiful show with such kind of bad underlying politics. It's incredible. Anyway, Yoshiro Iri's Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, Hideaki Anno's Neon Genesis Evangelion, Joss Whedon's Firefly. Yes, I know Joss Whedon is a horrible person and elements of that do come into the work, but I really enjoy character-driven sci-fi dramas, okay? The entire Star Wars saga, and Richard Curtis's About Time, which is kind of stretching it because it really is more of a rom-com than a sci-fi, but it makes me cry every time. Lastly, in terms of sci-fi to play, probably the one science fiction game which has really blown my mind was the original Mass Effect trilogy. Not necessarily because it was all that deep all the time, but because it's probably the first computer game I ever felt that it gave me real, meaningful moral decisions that didn't have an easy answer, and that actually had lasting impact on the story and my relationships with other characters, which kind of really, for me, blew my mind about what a game could be. I also don't want to wade into this too much, but I think that Mass Effect actually does a surprisingly good job of portraying, in terms of sexuality at least, certain queer identities, in that there are certain NPCs, for example, who just are gay and so cannot be romanced by players of the opposite gender, for example, when in a lot of games these days will have this kind of mechanical bisexualism where you as the player can romance anyone else, but no one else will ever reject you because you are not compatible with their sexuality, for example, except for very occasionally banning gay men relationships, which is just anyway. But I think obviously there are limits to how well Mass Effect did it. I think particularly there is a certain risk that, if I remember correctly, if you're playing as a character of a certain sex, you don't even get the option to try and romance people who are of the opposite who have a sexuality which wouldn't be interested in you, so you don't get that chance of sort of actively being rejected by someone, which I think is a bit of a shame because it doesn't mean that this content is kind of avoidable if you're just an out-and-out homophobe. You don't need to be made aware of that to some degree. So there are issues with it, and again, this is a massive tangent beyond the scope of this video, but generally, I think one thing that I do appreciate about the representation of sexuality in Mass Effect is you do have straight people, you do have gay people, and you do have bi people, and they are just like that, and that actually has a consistent impact across different playthroughs, and I think that's really, really cool. Anyway, in terms of runners-up, Outer Loop Games' Falcon Age is an excellent anti-colonial adventure which presents a deep and rich portrayal of what it means to rebuild community, traditions, and the environment in the aftermath of colonization. I would definitely say if you are a person living on colonial land, on stolen land, and you haven't got that colonized experience, play this game because it will really help with just some of that perspective. I've also enjoyed both Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic games as surprisingly rich character-driven RPGs for the time when they were released, and it's probably a bit of a stretch to use the term science fiction, but I've recently been really getting back into Pokemon, and that will always be one of my favourite game franchises that has stolen far too much of my money. You can tell that it was made by a butterfly creator who has a deep love of nature and the natural world, and it just emanates through every part of the game, and I love it. I genuinely love it. I've also heard that Mikhail Kasurinen's Control is meant to be excellent, but haven't had the chance to play it yet myself, so take that as a second-hand recommendation. Outside of computer games, I sadly haven't really had the opportunity to play in a sci-fi tabletop RPG, and I don't know how much sci-fi-ness directly influenced the gameplay of something like a board game. Like, I guess Coup would probably be my favourite sci-fi board game, but the sci-fi-ness doesn't really influence much beyond the character design. I do have the Starfighter core rulebook sitting on my shelf for the day when I get the opportunity to play, but that hasn't happened as of yet. As a bonus to this question, I actually feel like I probably need to mention that I do generally prefer fantasy to sci-fi, so if I'm talking about my favourite media, I cannot go without saying how Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books are just my all-time favourite novel series, media, story, ever. So if you want a single recommendation from me, go read Earthsea. Moving on to some of the anonymous questions, and the first one is focused on political ideology, asking, do you prefer a conceptual system of governance and social organisation built around a single ideological thread, or one built around a balancing act between a multiplicity of different frameworks? This is quite an interesting question, and one which I would argue actually requires a fairly nuanced answer rather than a simple either-or. Firstly, I would query what this notion of a conceptual system of governance is doing in this question. Is the question here about my own ideology, the ideological principles that govern a revolutionary movement, or about the actual superstructural composition of the society which I would like to build? In terms of revolutionary movements, I tend to hold by what I would call a pragmatic and sceptical left unity. I would argue that the various approaches to socialist ideology, which in the present day are mostly various forms of Leninism and various forms of anarchism, should each seek to build their own movements. Where their immediate material goals coincide, they should seek to cooperate to the fulfillment of those goals. If you're trying to provide meals in your community, to build temporary housing, to squat an empty property, plant a community garden, or defend a protest from fascist agitators, you're going to need all the help you can get, and ideological differences can be temporarily suspended in order to ensure these practical, material goals are achieved, as long as you're working with a group that will be able to work with you on that. However, 3 important caveats are needed, and this is where the skeptical part comes in. Firstly, many ML calls for left unity focus on subsuming anarchist movements into already existing ML organisations or groups. We're asked to give up our own independent communities and movements to become part of the ML hegemony. It is my belief that anarchists should absolutely reject all calls for such subsumption. While I see no reasons why anarchists cannot cooperate with ML orgs in, say, providing food for the homeless, this can never come on condition that the anarchists give up their independence or sacrifice their own principles to fit in with an ML organisational structure. Secondly, this pragmatic unity is always based on an actual equivalence of practical goals, and this must be proven not just in words but in actions. I've heard one too many horror stories of anarchists organising protests in deprived or racialised communities while having an ML group swing in, claim control of the protest, and then actively invite the police and the violence they represent into that deprived or racialised community just so the MLs could earn a little bit of extra media attention. In these cases, whatever the ML group may have said, their actual actions demonstrate very different material goals, and such attempts at co-opting materially effective movements for grandstanding should be resisted, especially if they introduce state influence and police violence into the mix. Thirdly and finally, anarchist movements in potentially revolutionary contexts, that is, in contexts where the material conditions are such that revolution and total system change is an imminent possibility, should be making preparations for how they will defend their own communities against ML state violence should the MLs take power. This is because history has shown on many occasions that MLs will gladly cooperate with anarchists to seize power and then immediately turn around and murder or imprison those anarchists once the capitalist state is overthrown. For this reason, anarchist movements should always be looking ahead to how they would defend themselves when the MLs inevitably turn around and turn on us should a revolution prove successful. Turning to the end goal, to some potential future post-revolutionary society, it would seem to me that you need to narrow down ideologically to some degree for any such system to be sustainable. For example, I do not believe you could settle on a system with various ML states with anarchist communes situated within and between them. The ML states would sooner or later turn the violent state machinery against the anarchists, and another revolution would be required to abolish these so-called socialist state machines. That said, I also believe that ideological purity is impossible in any actually existing anarchist socialist society. To give a specific example, I am an anarcho-communist. That's what the red and black flag in my background means. Which means that I believe that the end goal of socialist struggle should be a classless, moneyless, stateless society based on the principle from each according to their ability to each according to their need. That is, communism. Communism is definitionally moneyless, and thus, under anarchic communism, markets and money are abolished. More than this, however, the principle from each according to their ability to each according to their need means that we do not replace money and markets with some kind of barter system or even a gift economy, but rather with a system of distribution which is based solely around fulfilling need. I give it to you of what I make because you need it, and you give to me of what you make because I need it. This is fundamentally a debtless society. There is no notion of owing more or less or of unequal trade. Each person and each community simply gives as much as they are able, distributed to satisfy human need as much as is possible. Now, while I believe this kind of communistic system is the necessary end goal of any truly anarchic socialism, I also recognise, in line with the likes of Malatesta, that the point of anarchy is not some ultimate end goal, but continuous revolution. Anarchism is about providing us with the tools to progressively liberate ourselves from all forms of oppression. To this end, I would not argue for enforcing, in whatever way you could do that in an anarchist society, a communistic mode of distribution in the immediate aftermath of future social revolution, but would follow the pattern of previous anarchist experiments, where we see a mixture of different systems being used as people found them useful, using markets and money when they are useful, barter and exchange when they are useful, and communistic modes of distribution when they are useful. Ultimately, the form that anarchic socialism takes will always be a product of the particular material conditions out of which it arises and into which it develops, and the gradual and perpetual process of deconstruction and liberation at the heart of ongoing anarchic struggle. I would go so far as to say that not only is the expectation that future anarchist experiments should fit one or other pure anarchist theory simply unrealistic, but further still I would argue that requiring future anarchic experiments to fit in line with my own or any other particular interpretation of anarchism is anathema to the anarchist project itself. So long as hierarchy is being abolished and people are being liberated to simply live free of oppression and exploitation, that is all we can reasonably ask for as outsiders to this future community. Moving on, the next three questions were all anonymous and theological. The first of these questions asks, any views on Imago Dei, particularly when considering it in light of transhumanism? For those unfamiliar, the concept of Imago Dei refers to humanity being made in the image of God, a reference to Genesis 1:27, which in the CJB translation reads, "So God created humankind in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." In answering this question, I want to start by leaning on the works of the incredible Jewish philosopher and theologian Moses ben Maimon, commonly known in Christian circles as Maimonides. Now, it is important to caveat that Maimonides was a Jew writing for a Jewish audience. By adopting some part of Maimonides' theological teachings, my goal is not to try and subsume Judaism under Christianity, but to recognize an important perspective which, I believe, can be syncretically integrated into a Christian faith in a fruitful and rigorous way. One of Moses ben Maimon's most famous works is The Guide to the Perplexed, a theological work which seeks to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with rabbinical Jewish theology. One of the core theological principles put forward in this work is the idea that the various anthropomorphic descriptions of God given in Scripture should be understood as metaphors, attempts to grasp at the vastness of divinity in human terms. Now, many Christians would agree that references to God's strong hand and outstretched arm, to Moses seeing God's face or God's back from a cleft in the rock, and so on, are not references to a literal arm, hand, face, or back, but metaphors for the strength and immediacy of God. But Maimonides goes a step further, arguing that the same is true for emotional anthropomorphisms of God. References to God's anger, jealousy, joy, wanting, and so on should also be understood as mere metaphors trying to grasp the vastness and infinity of God through the lens of mere human emotion. Indeed, Maimonides goes so far as to say that taking any of these descriptions, either physical or emotional anthropomorphisms, as literal descriptions of God is a form of idolatry. For a fuller discussion of this, Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg has an excellent post on her blog about this topic. I would say that Maimonides is very much onto something here, at least with respect to the totality of God. This opens up an interesting question. If neither the physical nor the emotional language we use to talk about humans can be accurately applied to the totality of God, what does it mean for a person to be made in the image of God? Now, I imagine Maimonides has his own answer to this, one which is almost certainly more thorough than I could possibly come up with, but for now I want to put aside the Guide to the Perplexed and focus on how I would approach this issue through a Christian lens specifically. For me, to be made in the image of God is founded on two principles, being relational and being creative. By relational, I refer, within God, to the relationships which Trinitarianism posits among the three persons of the Godhead, if you hold by Trinitarianism, as well as to God's desire to have relationship with his creations, and within humanity, to the human need for connection and community, and our desire to relate to one another. In this regard, relationality can be considered the basis of love. By creative, I refer within God to the capacity and desire to create all things, and within humanity not just to artistic creativity, but to the desire and capacity to enact change within the world, that is, the capacity for labour. Thus, I'd say that people are not made in the image of God because they are bipedal mammals, or because they have a particular set of emotions, but because they are relational and creative beings. They interact with each other and the rest of creation, and enact changes in the world, and thus they are the sort of beings which reflect the creative and relational nature of God, and indeed the sort of beings that could fulfill the Pauline promise to become co-heirs with Christ. In the context of transhumanism, then, the real question becomes, is the goal of transhumanism to overcome the relational and creative aspects of humanity, or to reinforce them? Now, while I'm not especially plugged into the transhumanist project, I wouldn't describe myself as transhumanist, as I understand it, the main goal of transhumanism is precisely to utilise the creative desire in humanity to enhance the ways in which we can relate to and enact change upon the world. And in this regard, I don't necessarily see any conflict here between the transhumanist project and the concept of Imago Dei. That said, I am somewhat uncomfortable with the rhetoric around becoming more than human. To me, it seems to really undervalue what humanity is, but that's really an issue that would require a lot more research on my part into what is meant by those kinds of statements. The second theological question asks, what's your opinion on predestination and election? And I'm honestly surprised it took this long for Arminianism versus Calvinism to come up in my comments. The short answer would be that while I recognise some of the theological arguments for predestination and election, that there are certain verses which seem to support such an eschatology, I do not believe the evidence is weighty enough to outweigh the scriptural evidence and theological reasons against it. The longer answer would be to point out that I don't actually think that predestination or election matters. Let me explain what I mean by that. For those unfamiliar with the concepts, predestination is the idea that those who will be saved, whatever this means in your eschatology, are determined by God for all time, with election referring to the idea that those chosen by God to be saved are identified with Paul's concept of the elect. In infernalist and conditionalist eschatologies, those who hold by election usually hold that some subset of people are elect, while a universalist eschatology would hold that all people are elect. Now, obviously, under universalism, the idea that the sacrifice of Christ is sufficient for the salvation of all people, supported by verses like Luke 3:6, John 17:2, 1 Corinthians 15:22, and many others. Predestination is kind of trivially true, and election is a somewhat meaningless concept. All people are predestined for salvation in the sense that, once the sacrifice of Christ is fulfilled, all people are saved, irrespective of their belief or behaviours in the present life, and election is meaningless because the elect is just everybody. A similar conclusion is true in the Sheol eschatology found in the Old Testament. Under the Sheol theology, all the dead, both righteous and wicked, equally go to the same shadowy land after death, with people called to live righteously not to attain some award in the afterlife, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Here again, all people are predestined to Sheol, and election is a somewhat meaningless concept, eschatologically speaking. By contrast, a conditionalist eschatology, or even the biblically unfounded infernalism popular in many mainstream denominations, posits at least the possibility of some distinction between two possible fates in the afterlife. Under conditionalism, this is between eternal life for the righteous and the second death or simply passing away for the unrighteous, while under the biblically unfounded infernalist eschatology, this is a distinction between heaven and hell. Now, one would think this would make the notions of predestination and election relevant, right? Surely there is a meaningful difference between a world in which one's ultimate fate in the afterlife is determined by one's own choices, decisions, and actions, and one in which one's ultimate fate is determined from creation. However, I would argue that even under these, what I might call differentiated eschatologies, the notion of predestination and election are still largely irrelevant for one simple reason: limited epistemic access. What do I mean by this? Epistemic access, what things we can possibly know, is relevant to the predestination election issue in two regards. Firstly, we do not know whether the world we actually inhabit is one in which predestination and election are in play. And secondly, even if we lived in such a world, you would have no way of knowing whether you yourself were one of the elect. What this means is that in practice, even if you think predestination and election are plausible, you still need to act in a way as if you believe it may not be so. You still need to choose to follow Christ. You still need to pursue righteousness and justice, and to do all the things you would do if you didn't believe in predestination and election. I personally see this as equivalent to the problem of determinism and free will, right? At the end of the day, there is a fair bit of evidence to show that our actions are largely predetermined by our physical environment, our upbringing, genetics, our experiences, our habits, and so on. There is no such thing as a spontaneous action triggered by a sheer force of the will. Everything we do for a reason, and the reasons for which we do things are determined by our beliefs and character, and these beliefs and character are in turn determined by genetics, personal history, and experience. If this wasn't the case, we wouldn't really like the free will that resulted, right? If I could just act in some way completely disconnected from who I am as a person, that's not really me acting. But once we allow that our personal history, our experience, our personality, our beliefs influence how we act, this ultimately means that it is eminently plausible that for any decision we in fact make, we could not have made that decision otherwise, and thus free will in the philosophical sense is impossible. Regardless of this, however, we still need to decide to do things. I can't just lie in bed and expect determinism to get me up and into the kitchen to make breakfast. I have to get myself up. In other words, even though it's eminently plausible that the world is strictly deterministic, we must still act as if we had free will. And in the same way, while predestination and election are plausible under certain readings of scripture and certain eschatologies and whatever, even if you believe in them, you still have to act as if you have chosen salvation. And this really is why I tend to say that predestination and election just don't matter. I would say that the world is more morally rich and meaningful, our relationship with God is more meaningful if predestination is false. If we can actually choose to love God rather than God just picking, you're gonna love me and be saved, you're not gonna love me and will die, okay? But I would also say that even if you believe that predestination and election are true, you still have to act as if it isn't. So maybe we should just focus on acting in a righteous and just way, and let these sort of minutiae questions of eschatology that do not affect our actual lives at all wait until the new creation. Our next question is again anonymous and on the topic of theology. The questioner asks, I grew up in a conservative fundamentalist church. They preach the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, so for all my life, I was taught that the Bible is a historical book and everything written in it happened. They would of course point to verses like 2 Timothy 3:16 as evidence for this. I believed it for a time. If any one verse is incorrect or wrong, then how can we say with confidence that there are not any other verses that are wrong? If one is to believe in God, then the Bible has to be true or else everything falls apart. I became disillusioned with Christianity for many reasons, but one of them was the seeming lack of evidence for many of the biblical stories I was told were fact, like the Exodus, the reign of King David, and so on. Many of the original copies of scripture have been lost or tampered with. The motivation for why many things were written seems to be entirely political in nature. With these things seeming to be true, how can we confidently believe that anything in the Bible is inspired by the divine? Now this is such a rich topic, and is actually something that I'm planning to cover in a lot more depth in some future video or series. I want to do a whole video or series about how to read the Bible well. And one of the issues that I really want to talk about in that are these notions of inerrancy, infallibility, and inspiration. But the first thing that I want to just start answering this question now is start by looking at what the Bible itself says. And it's very important to recognize the Bible never claims to be either infallible or inerrant. There are two main verses which are used to argue for biblical inerrancy. The first, as the questioner noted, is 2 Timothy 3:16, which states in the NRSV translation, all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. The word translated as inspired here in the Greek is theopneustos, literally divinely breathed. The second major verse is 2 Peter 1:21, which states in the NRSV translation, because no prophecy ever came by human will, but by men and women moved by the Holy Spirit, spoke from God. Now what we see here is scripture talks about being divinely inspired, and of prophets being carried along and moved by the Spirit, but none of these phrases entails that God laid down the exact order or phrases of Scripture. All they really point to is the divine being in some sense behind or through Scripture or expressed within it. Further, there are many biblical passages which directly reject the idea of biblical inerrancy. For example, we can look at Numbers 12, where God declares that, "When there are prophets among you, I the Lord make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is entrusted with all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord." Thus, we see that in Scripture, God himself insists that to every prophet, save Moses alone, God speaks in visions, dreams, and riddles. This all points to the fact that, at a certain level, prophecy is necessarily an act of interpretation, and suggests that the writings of the prophets are the best attempts of human prophets to understand the visions and riddles that God has given them. Likewise, we see that what is written is not necessarily inerrant in stories such as the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27. Now, I know I've talked about this story a great deal because it is one of the most slept on but most important passages in all of Scripture, but the story basically goes that the daughters of Zelophehad challenge the sexist inheritance laws laid down in the law books, and when Moses brings their challenge before God, God affirms their challenge as correct and the law as wrong. All this seems to point to the idea that Scripture is asking it to be read as a collection of texts written by people about God, with God working behind the scenes in some ill-defined way. Certainly, the kind of scriptural inerrancy advocated for by fundamentalists seems to be completely off the table, and I would even say that stories like the daughters of Zelophehad challenge the more traditionally progressive idea of scriptural infallibility, which leaves us open with two important questions. What does it mean for Scripture to be inspired, if neither inerrancy nor infallibility hold up? And what is the basis of the authority of Scripture in matters of faith if it is not inerrant or infallible? For my part, I'd say the answer to these two questions are closely related. I would interpret Scripture being inspired to mean that it contains within it greater revelation of the nature of God and humanity than other texts. However, I maintain that this revelation is as often in spite of the intentions of the writers as it is because of them. In other words, Scripture is a collection of human texts written by people with their own social and cultural biases in particular historical contexts, which nevertheless reveals deep and profound truths about the nature of God, and divine inspiration is founded precisely in the fact that this flawed and meshed together text from different peoples and cultures across history still manages to reveal this consistent and complex pattern of who God is and how God relates to us, God's own creations. And as for authority, I would point to the fact that inerrancy and infallibility are generally never required for authority in, the real world or normal life. I do not trust my doctor because they are infallible or inerrant. They certainly are not. I trust them because they know stuff about bodies and how they work that I don't. I do not trust my professors because they are infallible or inerrant, but because they have knowledge in my field that I lack. Why then, if I can trust doctors and professors to have useful wisdom and knowledge for me, even though they are fallible, should we say that Scripture is only valuable if it's infallible? Rather, I'd say this: the authority of Scripture comes not from some inherent ontological property of inerrancy or infallibility, nor from the circumstances of its inscription, but from its content. Which is to say, I believe that Scripture uniquely contains wisdom and insight concerning the nature of God and our relationship with God, and for this reason, Scripture is authoritative in matters of faith. Scripture is authoritative because it is inspired, and it is inspired because even though it is both fallible and full of the foolishness of human wisdom, it nevertheless reveals great wisdom and profound depths of divinity. Lastly, I received 3 questions from Twitter user @JackWeb, all on the intersections between faith and politics. The first question asks, how did you evolve politically, and how did you find left anarchist Christian community? My political journey is very much a story of leftward drift. My family was gently left-leaning roots, My dad grew up working class in a poor neighbourhood under Thatcher, and suffering under her violent and cruel policies gave him a burning hatred of exploitation and oppression, especially as carried out by the Tory party of England, and that's something he definitely passed on to me. As such, most of my childhood and early political development was spent as a firm social democrat, supporting unions, pushing for increased universal healthcare, better wages, even UBI before that was as mainstream as it is now, but with no real political analysis underpinning this approach beyond we should strive to build a society that helps people. It was only really in my late teens that I started discovering socialism proper, originally through reading the Communist Manifesto and The State and Revolution out of curiosity, and then developing my understanding with further reading and with help from Marxist theory channels like Hakim, Axizi, and later Marxist Paul. Although I appreciate a lot of Marxist theory, and especially found the theoretical tools developed by Marx and later Marxists such as dialectical materialism very useful, I was always kind of uncomfortable with the Leninist approach to Marxism. It was pretty transparent to me that Lenin frequently contradicts Marx whilst claiming to side with him, which seemed deeply disingenuous, and the more Marxist theory I read, the more glaring inconsistencies seemed to arise. It was about this time that I first discovered Thought Slime and Sophie from Mars, and I became interested in learning more about the anarchist approach to socialism. I read The Conquest of Bread and various other anarchist texts, which I felt held up far more coherently than the Leninist texts I'd been reading before. Zoe Baker, formerly known as Anarchopac, provided excellent resources for reconciling my Marxist and anarchist sympathies, and my political development since that point has largely been one of broadening and deepening. This is the secular account, at least, but I should make clear that my political development has largely been in response to my growth into my faith. I returned to Christianity in my mid to late teens, in no small part because I read the Bible cover to cover for the first time and found within it a political project which was far more radical than the milquetoast social democratic politics which was being touted as radical left in the UK at the time. With the notions of Sabbath and Jubilee, the communistic living of the early church, and Jesus' refutation of wealth and earthly authority, I saw a political outlook that captured and reinforced my existing desire to see restitution and justice in a visibly broken and hurting world. My pursuit of political philosophy has entirely been driven by a desire to understand the political teachings of Scripture and Jesus as applied to a modern context. This was true as I moved from social democracy into Marxism-Leninism, and it was truer still as I moved further left into anarchism. Indeed, I need to give a special shout out here to Radical Reformation Christianity, who gave me the words to describe my growing political theology as Christian anarchism. And that pretty much brings me to the present day. I would identify as a Christian anarchist and an anarcho-communist, incorporating Marxist theory and analysis as one set of tools among many in my political arsenal. As for the second half of the question, I'm afraid I've been struggling to find much in the way of Christian anarchist community at all. I'm involved in various radical Christian spaces online, although most of these are sort of broad tent left Christian spaces rather than committedly anarchist, and in person, COVID regulations and changing life situations have really curtailed my ability to find the communities around me, though I'm still looking, and hopefully we'll be able to find comrades to come alongside soon. The second question from Jack Webb asks, what would you recommend Christians trying to influence their churches? This is an important question, but before I can give my thoughts on it, a little transparency is needed. Influencing the church or churches I worship at is something that I have struggled with and, as yet, have roundly failed at. A couple of years ago I left my church of 3 years, mostly out of concerns for personal safety, but if I'm honest with myself, also partially out of frustration at having been unable to save the people there from the sin and corruption of conservatism and reaction. I found a new, better church home, but even here, I have yet to bring a single person to a more radical understanding of their faith. So while I can give my thoughts on this, treat these words as with an appropriate pinch of salt, as theory that's not yet fully tested. It seems to me that there are 3 core principles to keep close to your heart when hoping to influence your church in a positive direction towards a deeper and more radical understanding of Christian faith. Firstly, know your scripture and church history. Many conservative and liberal Christians see left Christianity, Christian socialism, and Christian anarchism as modern inventions, a desire to change Christianity to fit the social sensibilities of the present age. In actuality, left Christianity and Christian anarchism are far closer to the teachings of the law, the teachings of Christ, and the practices of the early church than modern mainstream conservative traditions, and they have a long and storied history, extending through the practices of monastic communities and the German Anabaptists, through the teachings of John Paul and the liberatory struggle of the Peasants' Revolt in the 1300s, through the teachings of Gerard Winstanley and the work of the Diggers in the 1600s, through to the development of liberation theology and the role it played in the revolutions of Latin America, especially the Nicaraguan Revolution. So, study the meaning of Sabbath and the revolutionary principles that derive from it. See what Scripture has to say about the various social issues you consider most pressing. Examine Jesus' teachings, his compassion to those ostracized by society, and his call for the preferential option for the poor. Study the communistic practices of the early church and the liberatory Christian movements of the past. Will this understanding always be enough to convince others? No, of course it won't. For many conservatives, their conservatism, nationalism, and bigotry come first, and any appeal to Scripture is merely a post hoc justification for beliefs they already held. However, it's important to recognise that for those who are not committed conservatives and reactionaries, those who may still be amenable to a deeper, richer, more liberatory understanding of their faith, we are effectively in competition with the conservative mainstream. If the conservative pastor at the pulpit is stringing together grand exegeses and appealing to 2,000 years of institutional church traditions, and the only answer we have is, "But Jesus taught love," then of course few people are going to be persuaded to our cause. Yes, love is the heart of our ideology, of our theology, but we must show that we also have studied Scripture, that we have specific answers for conservative theological contrivances, not merely a general appeal to love. We must show that we also have an exegesis, that we also have a history, because these are the things that confer legitimacy in the eyes of many layfolk. Secondly, do not try and do this alone. Rarely can a single individual change a whole community by themselves, and when they do, the result is rarely healthy. This is why so many of the great anarchists of the past actively sought to reject any kind of celebrity about themselves. Now, unless you're very lucky, it's unlikely your local church community will have a small underground ring of budding Christian anarchists that you can just slide into. However, from my experience, most modern churches have at least some socially minded people who set up homeless drives or prison ministries or debt relief services, people who, at a certain instinctual level, understand Jesus' preferential option for the poor, but lack the social and political framework to understand that teaching beyond individual actions or a single church project. Find these people and find community with them. Consider ways of helping church projects move away from charity models towards mutual aid and a more direct engagement with community needs. Use the resources that your church makes available as a means of engaging in your anarchist praxis, and when people question why you do things the way you do, use this as an opportunity to teach them about your political theology. Thirdly and finally, know your limits. Deeply embedded cultures are rarely changed by a single individual, and so you need to be aware that change takes time and the cooperation of others in community. Always keep an eye on your own safety. If you're a queer person in a homophobic and transphobic church, it is probably safer to leave that church than to try and change the culture there, although that decision is always at your own discretion. I'd also encourage you to try and avoid getting stuck in a toxic or unhealthy church life with the sole goal of treating it as a project to be fixed. We need to remember that we go to church to find community and spiritual rejuvenation outside of the immediate, soulless crushing of modern capitalism. If your church becomes just another grind, you will likely find your spiritual needs are going unfulfilled. Understanding when to focus on changing the culture around you and when to focus on meeting your own needs is a complex and difficult task, a balance every radical must learn in every part of their life. But do not forget that you need to find this balance in your church life as well. The last question from Jacob asks, are churches in their current form even useful for Christian anarchists, or will political and religious changes ultimately shift how we do church? And I wanted to end on this question because I think it presents something of a false dichotomy, but one that I find often repeated on anarchist forums online. This idea that if something will be changed or replaced through the struggle for liberation, this entails that it is not useful for the liberatory struggle now. And I'd argue this is only half true. On the one hand, we as anarchists totally reject the principle that the ends justify the means, as Emma Goldman wrote in the afterword to My Disillusionment in Russia. There is no greater fallacy than belief that aims and purposes are one thing, while methods and tactics are another. This conception is a potent menace to social regeneration. All human experience teaches that methods and means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. They influence it, modify it, and presently the aims and means become identical. This is one reason among many why we as anarchists side with Marx and against Lenin when Marx asserted that the precondition for any true social revolution is the destruction of the state's machinery. One cannot use a state to create a stateless society. Through the social practice of subordination to the state becomes self-perpetuating, and thus the aims and means become identical. Because the state has become central to your revolutionary strategy, the state cannot now be done away with, unless a further social revolution occurs. The idea that the state can just wither away because there aren't capitalists anymore is as nonsensical and childish as the liberal idea that the invisible hand of the market will save everyone. On the other hand, we must recognise that social revolution is itself a creative and destructive process. We can see this most clearly in the theory of human development common to both anarchism and Marxism. It is not, generally, the anarchist view that people as we currently find them are fully capable of running a socialist and anarchist society. Our communities are so atomised by capitalism that we have limited experience organising and governing ourselves as communities. In our workplaces, we're often kept in the dark about aspects of organisation which do not pertain to the exact tasks we have been given. For example, how many cashiers know how the supply chains of their company work? Even in our interpersonal and familial relationships, we're so conditioned by cis-heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and every other hierarchy of social exploitation that we often lack both desire and capacity to live properly egalitarian lives. One need to only look to how much of housework falls on women, not because all men want their women to work more, want their wives to work more, but because those that don't often fail to recognise the work that needs to be done and, due to cis-heteropatriarchal conditioning, refuse to take the initiative to find out what work needs to be done of their own volition. They're always waiting to be told, which just places more burden of labour on the women. However, what we do hold is that a person's desires and capacities are not innate properties, but are created and recreated through the dialectal process of engaging in habitual activities. I may be bad at chess now, I really am, but if I continually practice, I will gradually develop the capacity to play chess well, and likewise I'll develop the desire to play chess more. I may be bad at recognising what housework needs doing now. I'm sure my partner would say I am. But the more I engage in housework, the more I will develop the capacity to recognise the work that needs to be done, and the more I will develop the desire to do it. By organising strikes, I learn how my workplace works and how to organise with my fellow workers. By organising with my community to build a community garden, I develop the capacities and desires necessary to organise with my community. This is the basis of the theory of praxis. We learn as we do. And by engaging in revolutionary activity, we become the kinds of people that liberatory social revolution requires. As I see it, the church falls somewhere between these two principles, depending on exactly what we mean by that phrase. On the one hand, the church can refer to the community of believers, and I would say that any form of cohesive community which has, to some degree, survived the atomization of capitalism and has, at least in its underpinning ideology, a certain space for radical ideas, can serve as a useful basis for radical action, because it circumvents the need to first develop a new community out of entirely atomized individuals. In this regard, I'd say that the church, as a community, is certainly useful for Christian anarchists in our revolutionary struggles, because if we can radicalize those members of that community, they already know to some degree how to interact with each other, and so there is already a basis there for community organising. However, it should go without saying that churches in the institutional sense, with their ecumenical hierarchies, dogmatism, centralised authorities, and demands for strict obedience and adherence, are not only unhelpful for Christian anarchists, but are actively contrary to our aims. And it is in these institutional and organisational aspects that church will necessarily be transformed in the process of social revolution. For my part, I personally consider the idea that religion will simply disappear under communism to be naive nonsense, to put it lightly, religion of some form has existed at every stage of human history because some people, not all, but some, simply have spiritual needs which are best met in community. The systems of power and control which modern religious institutions represent are superimposed upon the underlying faith and spirituality of individuals and communities. The latter precedes the former, it's not derived from it. Likewise, I also find somewhat naive the idea that all religion and spirituality will ultimately become simply a personal affair. To me, this reeks of neoliberal individualist brain rot. Why would we want spirituality to be individualized and atomized when we are calling for the rest of life to become socialized and communal? Rather, as we do away with the systems of religious coercion and the violent and exploitative institutions that dominate public religion in our present social order, I expect we'll see old notions of orthodoxy fall by the wayside in favour of a great diversification and syncretization of religious and spiritual expression. Out of this diverse religious experience, faith communities will continue to develop, coming together around common spiritual experiences and practices, but such communities will be anarchic institutions based on truly free association, with no guilt or prejudice if one moves from one community to another, with no indoctrination of children or forced proselytization of other communities. In many ways, I see a parallel here to how I understand the development of gender into communism. As we do away with the hierarchy of violence defined by cis-heteropatriarchy, we will see a great diversification of gender and sexual expression. But I don't call this gender abolition, because I do believe that we shall always see communities arising among those who have shared lived experiences, including gendered experiences. That said, it's also certainly true that our current gender notions are often defined in response to the gender binary of cis-heteropatriarchy, and so I'm sure that the gender communities that develop under a truly liberated society will just not neatly map on to the gender notions we currently possess. In this regard, gender as we know it now will be abolished, but gender as an expression of human diversity will flourish and grow. I could go on a great tangent here about the epistemic and conceptual limits of imagination and the ways in which language and concepts will be transformed through social revolution, but I restrain myself. All this to say that I think there are two answers to your question. If by churches you mean the actual communities of believers, then yes, I believe they are useful for Christian anarchist practices. They are pre-existing communities which, with time and care, can be radicalized towards liberatory practice and then become useful hubs for community organizing. However, I also maintain that these communities, how we do church, will be transformed through the process of social revolution, as practicing liberatory religion teaches us new ways of engaging in both faith and communal organising, and as the hierarchical institutions which now dominate church life are abolished. Thus, while I believe that anarchic Christianity will have its roots in the modern churches, its conclusion will look very different, much more like the communes of the early Jesus movement. And that is all for the questions, at least the ones that got in before I wrote and recorded this script. Thank you to everyone who sent them in. A lot of interesting ideas to talk about, and hopefully you found my answers at least a little interesting. I have several different ideas in the works for new videos. Some very complex thoughts about Arcane League of Legends, the thing that I was talking about with the how to read the Bible well, how to read the Bible like a communist, if you like. And I've also recently been hearing about some potentially very interesting research about Jesus' sexuality, but we'll get into that if we get into that. However, all that to say, right now I am bogged down with work. This video is coming out literally several weeks after I wanted it to because of how much work has slowed down the video writing and editing process, so don't expect a new video before the summer. I will try, I'll do my best, I will try and write the script, I'll try and get it recorded and everything, but don't necessarily expect it. As I say, I'm wanting to step aside from trying to give myself these strict limits and deadlines and upload schedules and just focus on making the best essays I can. Which also means that if you still find the essays to be a bit mediocre, that's just the limit of my ability, but we'll get to that when we get to that. God bless all of you, and thanks so much for coming on this journey with me. I'm still blown away by how many of you are willing to listen to my dumb rants on the internet. But keep strong, keep diving deeper into your faith, keep drawing close to God and Jesus, and until the next time, grace and peace.